Imagine waking up to find a group of HOA board members standing on your dock, clipboards in hand, furious expressions frozen on their faces, shouting that you're trespassing on their lake. That's exactly how my nightmare began, except it wouldn't stay a nightmare for long. Because what they didn't know was that buried deep in my office was a set of forgotten, decades-old legal documents capable of turning their entire claim upside down. Documents so powerful they would not only shut down their accusations, but expose a secret the HOA had quietly buried for years. And when I finally pulled those files out, everything from property lines to lake rights to every wooden plank beneath their feet would ignite into a war they never expected, and I was more than ready to fight. It all started on a calm Saturday morning. I stepped out onto my dock with a cup of coffee, expecting peace, not confrontation. But waiting for me were three HOA board members: Linda, the president with a permanent scowl; Mark, the rule enforcer who carried binders like weapons; and Sandra, who whispered but somehow still managed to threaten you. They pointed at my dock and announced the HOA was reclaiming their property. They said all docks belonged to the association, not individual homeowners. They said I owed fines, massive ones. And they expected me to comply immediately. I laughed, at first. Because for years, everyone on this lake had understood their docks were private. Families built them, repaired them, insured them. The HOA had never claimed otherwise. But the board insisted they had newly discovered documents proving everything belonged to them. The moment they said that, something clicked in my mind. Because I remembered my grandfather telling me long ago that when our land was purchased, the original developer included unusual rights tied directly to the shoreline. Rights almost no one knew existed. After that confrontation, I went straight inside, coffee still burning hot in my hand, and tore open the old metal file cabinet in my office. I didn't know exactly what I'd find, but I knew there was something. And once I dragged out a dusty, leather-bound folder labeled Property Rights, Original Agreement, I realized I was holding the beginning of the end for the HOA's false claim. My hands were shaking, not from fear. Because if these documents contained what I hoped they did, the HOA wasn't just wrong, they were about to be exposed for attempting a takeover they had no legal ground for. Every rumor, every whisper from neighbors about the board pushing new boundaries suddenly made sense. This wasn't an accident. It was a planned grab for power, and my grandfather's forgotten paperwork might be the one thing capable of stopping them cold. The moment I opened that leather-bound folder, the smell of old paper and dust filled the room, carrying with it the weight of decades of forgotten history. Inside were survey maps, handwritten notes, and stamped contracts from the original lake developer, documents I had only heard rumors about. But what truly caught my eye was a notarized agreement specifying that several shoreline parcels, including mine, came with exclusive dock rights extending a fixed distance into the water. It wasn't vague. It wasn't ambiguous. It was written in bold legal language: the docks belonged to the individual landowners, not any association. I spread the pages across my dining table like pieces of a puzzle. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. The HOA's claim wasn't just weak, it was non-existent. Not only did I own my dock, but the wording suggested I possessed rights to multiple dock locations the developer had marked for future expansion. Rights the HOA had conveniently ignored in their so-called new discovery. But here's where things got even stranger. In the back of the folder, tucked between survey sheets, was a photocopy of a letter from the original developer to my grandfather. The letter mentioned the HOA forming years later and warned that the board was attempting to reinterpret easements for collective control. It was almost prophetic. Someone had seen this fight coming before I was even born. Armed with that knowledge, I decided to test the HOA's confidence. I emailed Linda requesting copies of the documents they claimed proved their ownership. Her reply came almost instantly, short, cold, and defensive. She said the papers were internal materials and not necessary for me to review. That was my first real confirmation that they were hiding something. The next morning, I walked the shoreline and talked to neighbors. Almost all of them had received similar warnings from the HOA. Some had already been fined. Some were scared to speak up. But none of them had ever seen any official proof. When I told them about my grandfather's files, their reactions shifted from confusion to hope. They wanted answers. They wanted the truth. And that's when the idea hit me: if the HOA wanted to play games with information, I would expose everything. Publicly. Transparently. And in a way they couldn't twist or bury. Because once these documents came to light, the board's entire narrative would crumble. I didn't know it yet, but the real battle was about to begin, one that would turn the entire community against the HOA's lies. What I did next would shock not only the board but every homeowner on the lake. I gathered every scanned page, every map, every note, and prepared to reveal the truth. I knew exposing the truth couldn't wait, not when the HOA had already begun issuing fines, sending aggressive letters, and showing up unannounced on people's properties. So that evening, I organized everything into a digital folder and created a public link. But instead of quietly sharing it, I planned something that would force the HOA to confront the truth in front of the entire community. I drafted an email titled "The Real Ownership of Our Docs Public Evidence" and scheduled it to send to every homeowner at 9 a.m. the next morning. Then, just to make sure the HOA couldn't spin the story, I printed physical copies, 2 thick stacks of raw history ready to hit the board like a tidal wave. But before the email even went out, something unexpected happened. At exactly 8:17 a.m., I heard tires crunching on my gravel driveway. I looked out the window and saw Linda, Mark, and Sandra storming toward my front door with the determination of people who knew they were running out of time. They didn't knock, they hammered. When I opened the door, Linda's face was bright red. "We need to speak with you," she barked, pushing her way forward as if she owned the place. Mark had a clipboard tucked under his arm, and Sandra hovered behind them, clutching a folder like it contained the nuclear codes. "We've received reports you're distributing misinformation to the community," Linda said. "We're here to issue a formal cease and desist." I almost laughed. "Misinformation?" I asked. "You mean the actual developer contracts? Or the notarized doc rights? Or the letter explaining how your board has been overstepping for years?" Mark stiffened. Sandra's eyes widened. Linda's mouth twitched. "You're not authorized to interpret historical documents," Linda snapped. "The HOA has legal counsel. And they're welcome to read the files," I said. "Along with everyone else. In about 40 minutes. That's when she realized. "You're sending something out." I didn't deny it. Instead of arguing, I stepped aside and let them see the documents spread across my dining table: maps, deeds, signatures, surveys, letters, all laid out like evidence in a courtroom. For a moment, none of them spoke. The truth was too clear, too overwhelming. Mark was the first to break. "Where did you get these?" His voice wasn't angry, it was scared. "My grandfather," I replied. "And they're legally binding." The panic in their eyes told me everything. They hadn't expected this. They thought I'd back down, fold, or be intimidated. Instead, they were staring at proof that not only was their claim false, but they had been enforcing rules they had no authority to enforce. Linda tried to regain control. "Even if these documents are real, the HOA has jurisdiction. Not over property you don't own," I said quietly. The moment the email left my outbox, a quiet shockwave rippled through the entire community. I watched Linda's expression freeze as she realized she was powerless to stop it. Her eyes darted between me and Mark, searching for some kind of lifeline, but there wasn't one. Every homeowner on the lake, every family they had bullied, fined, or intimidated now had the full truth sitting in their inbox. And it was only a matter of minutes before the consequences began. The first sign arrived almost instantly. My phone buzzed again. Then again. Then non-stop. Neighbors were responding in real time, some confused, some angry, some relieved. Others attached photos of letters the HOA had sent threatening to remove their docks entirely. A few wrote messages I'll never forget, "I knew something was wrong. Thank you for doing this. We're behind you." While this was happening, the board members stood frozen in my living room like statues caught in headlights. Sandra was trembling slightly. Mark kept rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Linda, always composed, always authoritative, finally lost the mask. "We can fix this," she muttered, mostly to herself. "We'll hold an emergency meeting. We'll make a statement." "No," I interrupted. "You won't spin this. Not this time." Before she could respond, the sound of voices carried from outside. Through the window, I saw neighbors gathering along the shoreline. People were leaving their houses, pointing at their phones, comparing documents, talking in heated whispers. The truth had spread through the community faster than the HOA ever imagined, and now the board had to face the very people they claimed to represent. I stepped out onto the porch as more neighbors approached. Some held printed copies of my files. Others brought binders filled with their own correspondence from the HOA. The crowd grew by the minute, forming a semicircle around my yard. And all eyes turned to the board members standing behind me. Linda stepped forward, trying to project authority. "Everyone, please calm down. These documents are being misinterpreted," she insisted. "The HOA has full jurisdiction over." "No, you don't," one neighbor said firmly, cutting her off. "These contracts are clear." Another added, "You fined me 3 times for dock repairs I legally owned. You threatened to tow my boat. You lied to all of us," someone else shouted. The board's control dissolved instantly. Every attempt to speak turned into a wave of pushback. Homeowners demanded accountability, explanations, resignations. Finally, after several minutes of chaos, I stepped forward and held up the original notarized agreement. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze. "This," I said, "is the truth. My dock and many others were never yours to claim. And now everyone knows it." The crowd erupted in agreement. The HOA, exposed and cornered, had no power left. Prepared for what happened next. Because once the community realized how deep the deception went, things escalated in a direction even I hadn't expected. By the following morning, nearly every homeowner had gathered in the community lodge. Some carried folders of their own HOA disputes. Others arrived just to witness what they hoped would finally be the board's downfall. There was a buzz in the air: anger, relief, anticipation. The kind of energy a room feels when people know a long-standing injustice is finally about to crack. The board entered quietly. For the first time since I'd met her, Linda didn't radiate control. She looked smaller. Mark stared at the ground, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Sandra clutched a stack of papers so tightly her knuckles turned white. They took their seats at the front table, but no one in the room waited for them to speak. One of the homeowners, a retired attorney named Paul, stood first. "I've reviewed the documents shared yesterday," he announced. "And after going through the historical deeds, the developer agreements, and the original easements, there is no legal basis for the HOA to claim ownership of the docks. None." Murmurs filled the room, some angry, some vindicated. Another homeowner spoke next. "You fined us. You threatened us. You acted like you owned what never belonged to you." She turned directly to the board. "We deserve answers." Pressure built as more residents shared their stories. Year-old fines. Threats. Emails. Every testimony painted the same picture: an HOA that had slowly pushed its authority beyond its legal limits, hoping nobody would question it. Finally, the board had to respond. Linda rose slowly, cleared her throat, and attempted to steady her voice. "We acted based on the information available to us," she said. "Our goal has always been to protect the community. The room erupted with disbelief. I stepped forward, holding up the original developer's letter. This information was always available. You simply never bothered to look, or worse, didn't want to. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. That's when Paul, the attorney, proposed what everyone had been secretly hoping for. "I motion," he said firmly, "that the current HOA board be removed effective immediately and replaced by an interim committee elected by the homeowners." The reaction was instant: cheers, applause, nods of support. The vote wasn't even close. Minutes later, the board that had tried to seize the lake was officially dissolved. We won. Not just for the docks but for the truth. The fall of the HOA board should have been the end of the story, but instead, it became the beginning of something far bigger. Because once the community reclaimed its voice, people started digging deeper, asking questions no one had dared to ask before. And what surfaced in the weeks that followed shocked even me. The board's attempted takeover of the docks wasn't just a misunderstanding or a power grab, it was part of a much larger scheme quietly brewing beneath the surface. It all started when Paul, the retired attorney who had led the charge, requested a full audit of the HOA's financial records. According to the bylaws, homeowners had every right to review past budgets, expenses, and board activities. But when the interim committee requested those documents from the former board, they found glaring holes. Missing statements. Unexplained transactions. Checks issued to contractors no one had ever seen working in the neighborhood. Then came the bombshell discovery: multiple payments made to a private development company that specialized in lakefront renovation projects. Payments signed by Linda and approved by Mark. Payments that totaled more than any routine maintenance should ever require. But the real red flag: the development company had recently submitted a proposal to the county for a massive lake improvement project, one that included removing privately owned docks and replacing them with rented, HOA-controlled slips. It all clicked at once. The fines, the intimidation, the sudden claim that the HOA owned every dock. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about safety. It was about money. The former board had been preparing to convert the entire shoreline into a revenue-generating operation, where homeowners would be forced to pay monthly fees just to use the space that was legally theirs. When the community learned the truth, outrage turned to unity. Meetings became strategy sessions. Neighbors who rarely spoke to each other suddenly became allies. The interim committee filed formal complaints with the county. An investigation was launched. And slowly, piece by piece, the full picture of the board's corruption came into focus. But amidst all the chaos, something else happened, something I hadn't expected. People started thanking me. Not politely, not casually, but sincerely. Homeowners stopped me on the dock. Families waved from their porches. One elderly couple even brought over a homemade pie with a note that simply said, "You saved our lake." And in those moments, I realized something important. I hadn't just defended my own property. I had defended a community that had been quietly pushed around for years. I had sparked a fight that should have happened long before I ever opened that dusty leather folder. By the time the investigation concluded, confirming the board's misconduct and permanently barring them from holding office, the lake felt different. Freer. Happier. Ours again. And every time I stepped onto my dock, I felt the same quiet satisfaction. The HOA tried to steal the lake. But we took back far more than they ever expected. Even after the investigation wrapped up and the corrupt board members were permanently removed, the lake community found itself standing at a crossroads. We had won the battle, but the question lingering over everyone was, what now? Without a functioning HOA board, some feared chaos. Others feared overcorrecting into a completely hands-off system. But for the first time in a long time, the community had something the old board never gave us: a choice. The interim committee called a meeting at the lodge to discuss the future of the neighborhood. This time, instead of tension and distrust, the room felt alive with possibility. Neighbors who had once avoided these meetings now arrived early, carrying notebooks, ideas, and even homemade snacks. It didn't feel like an obligation, it felt like rebuilding. Paul stood at the front and cleared his throat. "We can't erase what the previous board did," he began. "But we can create something better. Something fair. Something transparent." He paused, scanning the room. "So today, we decide how our community will function moving forward." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then hands shot up. One resident suggested eliminating the HOA entirely. Another proposed keeping it but restricting its power. A third suggested a hybrid system where volunteers handled maintenance while formal decisions required community votes. Every idea sparked conversation, laughter, even debate, but for the first time in years, people weren't fighting against each other. They were building with each other. When my turn came, I stood and addressed the room. "What happened with the docs wasn't just about documents," I said. "It was about control. About a small group deciding what was best for everyone else. If we're going to move forward, we need to make sure no board now or in the future can operate in the shadows again." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. So I proposed something bold, a full digital transparency system. Every decision, every expense, every action taken on behalf of the community would be posted publicly in real time. No closed-door meetings. No hidden budgets. No mystery fees. If the community had access to the truth, corruption couldn't grow. The room erupted in applause. By the end of the meeting, the votes were counted. The new system passed overwhelmingly. The HOA wouldn't be dissolved, but it would be transformed. Power would no longer rest in the hands of a few, it would be distributed among everyone. The community elected a temporary steering group made of diverse homeowners, young families, retirees, long-timers, newcomers. People who cared. As we left the lodge, neighbors lingered outside, chatting beneath the warm glow of porch lights reflecting off the lake. The air felt different, lighter. We had reclaimed our rights. But more importantly, we had reclaimed each other. In the weeks that followed the creation of the new transparent system, the lake community underwent a transformation no one could have predicted. What had once been a quiet neighborhood overshadowed by an overreaching HOA was now buzzing with collaboration, ideas, and a sense of ownership that went far beyond the docks. And strangely enough, it wasn't the policies or the reforms that made the biggest difference, it was the people finally seeing one another as allies instead of subjects to be managed. One of the clearest signs of the shift came during the first community workday. In the past, the old board would hire overpriced contractors to handle everything, sending homeowners the bill afterward without warning. But now, under the interim steering group, residents volunteered to pitch in. Families raked leaves along the common path, teenagers cleared debris from the walking trail, and retirees repainted the community benches. Laughter echoed across the shoreline, a sound that had been rare during the tense final months of the old board's reign. During a break, I found myself standing with several neighbors near the water's edge. Someone pointed toward the horizon where the sun was setting behind the treeline, turning the lake gold. "You know," one neighbor said, "I didn't realize how much we'd lost until we got it back." Others nodded, and I felt the same thing, a quiet pride in what we had built together. But the biggest surprise came when a county official reached out, requesting a meeting about the new transparency system we'd implemented. It turned out other neighborhoods had been dealing with similar HOA problems: mismanagement, hidden finances, improper authority. Word of our victory had spread further than we expected. They wanted to know how we had done it. When the steering group gathered to discuss the request, we all shared the same realization: our fight wasn't just about saving our docks, it had become an example of how ordinary residents could take back control, expose corruption, and build something better. The idea that other communities might benefit from our journey became a source of unexpected pride. Still, not everything was perfect. A few former supporters of the old board quietly complained about the new system, insisting things had been easier when a small group made all the decisions. But transparency isn't always convenient, and this time, the majority wasn't willing to surrender the freedom they just reclaimed. As for the shoreline itself, the transformation was unbelievable. Boats glided peacefully across the water, families fished from their own docks without fear of fines, and the sense of ownership, true ownership, returned stronger than ever. Every time I looked at the lake, I felt the same unshakable truth. We hadn't just exposed a lie. We had restored a legacy. And the lake, once threatened, was finally where it belonged, in the hands of the people who loved it. As the months passed, the lake community didn't just stabilize, it flourished. With the corrupt board gone, the shoreline buzzed with life in a way that felt almost unreal compared to the tension that had once smothered it. Kids rode bikes freely along the path without being chased down for violations. Couples kayaked at sunset without worrying about unauthorized dock usage. The sense of peace that returned felt like a reward we had all earned through battle. But despite the calm on the surface, something lingered inside me, a feeling that our journey wasn't entirely finished. I'd spent so long fighting the HOAs lies, exposing their schemes, and protecting what rightfully belonged to this community, that I hadn't fully processed the impact the entire ordeal had left behind. The lake had changed, the neighborhood had changed, and in many ways, so had I. One afternoon, while sitting on my dock with a cup of coffee, I saw Paul approaching. His face carried the relaxed confidence of a man who no longer had to fight uphill battles in every meeting. "Got a minute?" he asked. I nodded. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, staring at the rippling water. "You should know," he finally said, "the county's investigation is formally closed. The board's actions are officially recorded as misconduct. They won't be able to serve in any organizational capacity for years." A weight I didn't even realize I still carried lifted slightly. Then he added, "There's one more thing. The steering group is nominating you for the permanent committee. You don't need to accept. But after everything you've done, well, the community trusts you." I didn't answer right away. The idea of joining an official committee felt strange, almost ironic. Months ago, I couldn't stand the people in charge. And now I was being asked to help lead. But the difference was clear: this wasn't a power grab. It was a responsibility. One born from truth, not control. "I'll think about it," I said. Paul smiled. "That's all we ask." As he walked away, I stared across the lake and realized something important: defending my dock had led to defending an entire community. And now, the same community wanted me to help guide its future. Later that evening, as lanterns lit up along the shoreline and neighbors gathered for a casual cookout on the common lawn, I watched families laughing, kids running, and music drifting softly over the water. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore, it was a place rebuilt from the ground up by the very people who lived in it. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for me to help protect what we had created. The fight was over. But the legacy was just beginning.